What's going on, beautiful people? We're back again with another Mental Max Out podcast. And as always, if this is not your first time, welcome back. But for all those first time visitors, we're so excited that you chose to take some of your time to just listen. And it's always appreciated. We're just going to jump right into it. This past week was a little fun for me because Allison's dad came into town and we definitely needed it and we used it as a break. And so it was good for us, just being a break from being a mom and dad for that second. We went to the movies, and it's been a long time that we've gone to see the movies. But in this particular movie, we went to go see Inside Out. And we loved the first one so much. Not trying to spoil it for any of you guys out there, but just, the main character, Riley, is about a little girl, and she's learning to deal with her emotions, and she's learning to figure those things out. It's about a story about a person understanding how to deal with their emotions in real time. And what does that look like, from feeling joy to transitioning into sadness, feeling anxiety, but learning how to deal with it to be successful? I think sometimes we look at our emotions and we actually start to identify ourselves with those emotions. We look at things that happen through different stages in our lives and we say, well, because of this one particular moment, this is who I am. This is me. Take Joy, for example. That's one of the characters in the movie. But when we look at Joy, we say it's a feeling of being positive, feeling happy. But when there's days we're not happy and we just have an off day, we aren't experiencing joy anymore. And because of that, it can make us spiral. And I think sometimes we allow our emotions to kind of take us in many directions. Sometimes we don't want to go. One of the biggest transitions for me is being a dad. Last year it was being a husband, but this past year we celebrated our daughter turning 1. But in that, there's always something that I have to juggle. There's always something that I have to make sense of. And one of those biggest things that I've had to make sense of is just being a man. I think this has been one of the most challenging years of trying to understand what it is for me to be a man. Is that the husband time? Is that how much time I spend with Serena? Is that how much time I pour into myself? And in all those things, I end up being confused. I end up sometimes feeling overwhelmed. I sometimes look at the bigger picture and I say to myself, I don't know if I have enough energy to go to Serena and Allison and then me. And because I'm not filling any of those cups, I feel frustrated that I think I'm not giving one to the other, or I'm taking away from another. And I feel selfish in those moments. For you guys listening out there, what are some examples for you that you feel like you're being pulled in many different directions? Like you're being pulled in a direction where when you're giving to work, you're feeling selfish because you're pouring into work and you think you should be pouring into your family. When you're pouring into your relationship, you're not pouring into work, and that makes you feel off. That makes you feel bad. You might be pouring into your relationship and not your kids, and it's just affecting you. So what are some of those things? For one big example of how we look at emotions, especially this character in this movie of Inside Out, yes, her emotions are within her, but we have to understand that our emotions are guiding us. They are not our identity. We have to understand that when we feel moments of joy, when we feel moments of sadness, anxiety, these different things, they're guiding us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's who we will stay and become. We have to be mindful of how our emotions in certain situations controls our actions. There's a lot of times where I see like a clip of somebody not getting an order they want, or someone getting cut off in traffic, and you see it all the time, but the other person reacts in a way where they can't take that action back. They've allowed their emotions to take over. From a mistake on an order or from somebody cutting you off, it's now road rage. You're going viral because somebody's recording you jump over the cashier, and it didn't start off that way. But because we looked at being angry and we felt offended in that moment, we started to become really upset in that moment. And those are just some of the examples of like what it really looks like when we allow our emotions to start taking us to places. When we allow interruptions in our lives to jump in, we then figure out, well, I didn't want that interruption to happen to me. I didn't want that particular thing to disturb my peace And so now I can't focus. There was a research study done in Washington University to actually look a little bit deeper into focus being interrupted with something. And so for this research study, what they did was they took two groups, and in one group, they gave them a task and interrupted them. They said, you're going to be now given a new task, but you're going to still be able to come back to your first, and you're going to have more than enough time to finish. And then in the second group, they interrupted them with a task and said, when you go back to your first task, you won't have as much time. And what they discovered was that people were going into the task not fully engaged because they didn't finish the first task. Group 2 was going into the task not fully engaged into their new task because they still were thinking about all the things they had to do for the original task. The first group actually was able to shut off their thought process from the first task and go into the second thing because they knew they were going to have more time when they got back. Do we sometimes feel that when things happen in our lives, we get interrupted? And when we get interrupted, we get flustered. We get upset that those particular things are happening to us. We feel uneasy. But also in those interruptions, one of the biggest discoveries was the fact that they're not fully engaged. You can go to a new task, but if you still have the first one on your mind, you're not fully there. You're not fully present in the moment. So yeah, you might be there physically, but you're not there mentally. And so what they had to do and what they actually did was they suggested writing it down. The next time you feel interrupted with something, write it down. Write down what's happening, what's going on, and write down what you want to do next. And from there, what you want to do next will come back as a time for you to be able to say, okay, where did I leave off from? And that was one of the ways that they started to realign their focus and not be overwhelmed in these emotions and these feelings. What I had to do was I had to allow for grace for interruptions. In the middle of a PhD, I try to find moments where being able to fully invest my thinking and my thought process into that next line and that next sentence, because at some point I want this work to matter. But in the beginning of my dissertation process, what I learned and what I realized was my daughter wants to play. Allison might need a break. There might be something that constantly is coming up that interrupts that. And in the beginning, I was very frustrated that I couldn't get any time. I was upset that something was always jumping into my time. Now, what I do is I make a note on my paper of where I was at, and I make a note in that paper and saying, what was my thought before I close my laptop and go to play with Serena, or before I close my laptop and help Allison? And when I come back, I'm right back to where I left off, and I say, oh, okay, that was my thought. Okay, that's what I wanted to do. So one of the biggest things for us when we look at these things, and how do we not allow for anger and fear and these things to interrupt us and actually start to drive us, because remember, our emotions are guides. We are in control of how we get there. So for me and for you guys thinking out there, look for things that you can take control of that are in front of you now. What are some of those things that you can do right now? Because when you think about the end of the day, or when you think about something that's you'd have no control over, you start to worry. You start to get a little anxious. And then in some cases, you might even feel overwhelmed at the process, overwhelmed at some of the things that are starting to happen. So start to take care of some of the things that are in front of you now. Also, allow for grace to interrupt you. So when things interrupt you next time, have grace in that. Because if it is something that interrupted you, it probably is important. It probably did need your attention. And if it needs your attention, be there in body and in mind. And then lastly for that, remind yourself of who's driving. Because if you start to feel overwhelmed and you start to feel anxious, you might say or do things or disengage from the particular situation. And then in that moment, we can't get those moments back. So something that just came off the top of your head because you were frustrated or because you were overwhelmed is something you now can't get back. So remind yourself of who is driving. Since college and being in this new stage of my life as a father, entrepreneur, doing these things, I've had to continue to practice understanding how to handle my emotions better, understanding how to take my emotion and almost per se smooth it out, looking at the situation and not being overwhelmed. And so one of the biggest things for me was starting to practice mindfulness. I know when people think about people that are positive and people that have great energy, they think of this term as mindfulness as something that is almost like magic. It just happens. It's floating in the air. But in actuality, mindfulness, the pure focus and the pure just thing of mindfulness is to achieve a state of alert, focused relaxation. And you can do this by paying attention to your emotions, your thoughts, and sensations. So what's those things that can help you get to a pure state of relaxation? I'm a huge sensory guy, and listening to things is huge for me. So before I start my day, or even at the end of the day, I would listen to the sounds outside because I would start to turn my brain on. And listening to the sounds outside started to kind of melt away the have tos, the to-do list, the I gotta get this done by this time. It almost put me at a peace, calm, steady state of mind. Another thing that I would listen for was the cars outside. I would take that in as almost white noise for me. When I started doing that, I started to realize that that was now 5 minutes of my time, 6 minutes of my time, and I was now putting my brain, my body, myself in a state of relaxation because I was able to listen to these sounds, and these sounds were calming me down. For you listening out there, what are some of the things you need to stop and be mindful of when you're in the middle of an argument? Being able to stop and just recognize that we're not really getting anywhere right now. We're kind of going in circles, or feeling like there's a little bit too much on your plate, and the next person that says something to you, you just might get a little overwhelmed. What we have to recognize is our words that we're using can sometimes hurt us. They can sometimes be projected at other people, and we don't really mean that. One of the things that we try to do very well in this house is we don't use words like always. You always say that. You always say you're going to do this, but you don't. Or we don't use never. You never do this, because now that's projecting on the other person. And so from there, we try to explain what we mean. So instead of using such a definitive statement of always and never, we actually try to now take that back and say, hey, I'm really upset in this moment. I feel like you didn't really hear me. And it now opens up the door for conversation. Another way to be mindful is taking a moment to step away. If you're in a moment right now where something is not going the way you want, or you're trying to get your point across, but now your voice is getting louder. Now the point that you were trying to make is a jab at the other person. Take a moment. Ask if you can step away for a second and reflect on the situation. Because now that we can do that, we can actually come back with a more sound reasoning for why we feel the way we feel. A more sound adjustment of, hey, thank you for giving me that second. This is what I was trying to say, but I just didn't have that ability to do that. Understanding we can speak slower. A lot of times in arguments, people are trying to win, but they're not trying to be heard, and they're not trying to be understood. If you're talking to someone that you really care about, or you're in a relationship with someone, or you're just feeling that at work, sometimes speaking slower can actually make the other person hear you more. But if you're only raising your voice and you're getting louder, guess what the other person is going to do? They're going to get defensive. They might shut down because of how much higher we're starting to raise our voice. We're starting to get angry that they're not listening to us. So if we can take a second, go back and pause, we can now be able to clearly explain how we feel and why we feel that way. So as I said earlier, for me, writing is very difficult for me because when I write, I have to be fully involved. I have to be fully engaged in writing, and I wasn't in the beginning. And I've been in this process for the past 4 years now. So for me, one thing that I've had to do is allow myself to be able to give myself a minute, tell myself it's okay to step away from my paper. It's okay to explain to Allison that I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I need a second. I'm trying to get this one part down. but I can't right now because of what's going on around the house. And so it's actually allowed us to have deeper conversations, because now I'll bring that to her and she'll then say, okay, what are you struggling with? She'll ask me questions about my paper, or she'll say, what do you need me and Serena to do? And she'll be willing to now make an adjustment, but she didn't know that at first until I was actually able to verbalize what I was going through. So when we're in those moments, when are some times where you can find yourself being able to slow down? Is it driving to work? Or is it just being able to say, I need a second. I need just a couple minutes to understand. Another thing I think people can do to work on their mindfulness is they can practice just sitting in your driveway for like 5 minutes before you go into the house. And in that moment, you're controlling your breath. You're controlling what you need to do and how you need to think about it. And then when you're able to walk in the door, you know you're walking into the house fully engaged, fully ready to pour into whatever is needed of you. But you can't do that if you're feeling rushed and overwhelmed and anxious. So as I said earlier, in the movie of Inside Out, it's a very cute movie. So, you know, if you're one of those people that want to see a cute movie with your kids, or just want to see something about yourself to have a very intellectual conversation and self-reflection, it's a really good movie. They were talking about long-term memory. And they were talking about how in these long-term memory, they didn't want some things to go there because that was hurting them. And that's how we think about it sometimes. We think about some of our memories as they could potentially hurt us. And so we try to bottle them up. We try to build these fences to not be hurt by them. And I would see this all the time. I once worked with someone who was hurt by their former boss. And anytime we talked about work, they would shut down. They would just shut down, and they could not even think about how could we communicate a point, an idea, because they were bringing up how the other person didn't like their ideas, how their former boss didn't like them, how they just made things difficult. And at times it would make it very hard to be able to explain and talk to that person because they had such a bottled up viewpoint of everything else that it was hard for them to trust. From that, we want to share that your feelings and memories are valid. Your past, the things you go through, the things you've experienced, they are valid. But allowing them to control you and your actions may not be. Allowing them to take you places that you don't want to go, that you're not comfortable in sharing, and that you're not comfortable in being because of something in the past may not be helping you currently. So we have to get into a state of practicing forgiveness. And sometimes the best way to practice forgiveness is to give it away. When you say the word forgiveness, the very first thing is, who hurt me? Because that's a very human thing. We want to make sure that we are protected and we're safe. And so when we say the word forgiveness, we instantly think about the people that hurt us. And we instantly think about why, how did I get there? I don't want to repeat that. But one of the best ways you can practice forgiveness is to give it away, meaning you can forgive them. I'm not saying for you to be friends with them. I'm not saying for you to just let bygones be bygones, but you can forgive them. You're now giving your body the ability to move on. And there's nothing I can do about it anymore. And so I'm forgiving them. My trust for them is different, but I do forgive them, and I'm willing to move on now. My pastor would always say, the people that offended you likely aren't thinking about you anymore. And so when you were offended and you were hurt by the things that were said to you, the things that were done to you, they've already moved on. But what we end up doing is we end up internalizing those feelings, that ability of earlier about my coworker that I used to work with. It's taken us years to even work towards forgiving. But it's a continual practice that this person has truly put into being able to trust, being able to move on, understanding that that was a different stage in their life, and that was a different stage in their employer's life. They're no longer that person. So now that they're no longer that person, they have the freedom to move forward. They have the ability to now go forward and accept newer things that are coming their way. So if you have any negative memories around you, any negative things, and it's not helping you, finding ways to let go. Can you now give them forgiveness? Can you now no longer feel offended? Because again, they've already moved on. Can you now say to yourself, I'm willing to move on from this. I'm willing to take this moment and go forward. And all of these things, when we think about ourselves and we think about our emotions, we have to, at the end of the day, be able to not let things like fear, anger, and those things drive us. Remember, our emotions are guides. They're not who we are. And so we have to allow for things like grace and interruptions to happen. Because now that they can happen, we can now move forward and recognize that we can take a moment to pause. We can take a moment to acknowledge that interruption is happening, this thing is happening, and I can be present in that moment. I can be fully engaged physically and mentally in that moment, and I can move forward, do that, and go back to my original task because I've had grace with myself and what's happening around me. And then lastly, understanding that there will be some things that we're going to have these grudges. We have these long-term memory walls and fences built up of things that have kept us hidden and hurt us in the past. Can we now forgive? Can we now look at it differently and give our forgiveness to that situation so we can now have the ability to move forward? Have the ability to look at a situation and say, that's not me. And all of these things, if we're able to do that, not only will our emotions start to work together, but we can now start to go in a direction that we don't feel like we're being controlled. We now are controlling where we want to go. At the end of the day, when you take all of these things in, I never want you to think like me. I just want you to think differently. Your emotions are there to help.